Hi everyone, welcome to Karwan. This is Ishan. And with me, I have a very special guest, Manu S. Pillai. And Manu is the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans and the Courtesans, the Mahatma and the Italian Brahmins. He was formerly Chief of Staff to Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament. He's also the winner of Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2017. Uh, and today we are here to discuss his latest release. The book is that you can see False Allies, India's Maharajas in the Age of Ravi Verma. And India's Maharajas have traditionally been cast as petty despots consumed by lust and luxury. Visual parasites, they cared more, we are told, for elephants and palaces than for schools and public works. And they had, as per the perceptions, they have very little role to play in modern India. And in his brilliantly researched book that I read recently, he disputes this view. And in this conversation, we are going to talk more about it. So, Manu, welcome to the conversation. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much for having me and good to see you a second time.
Yes. So, I'll start off with you can keep your phone on the table, so that won't
Okay.
be a problem. Why the title False Allies? It really is intriguing.
Because you see, the official position of the Maharajas was either as pillars of the empire and allies of the Raj, or they were, of course, stereotyped and caricatured and made fun of. Whereas I, in my study of these five princely states that I cover in the book, found that in reality, although they were officially allies of the empire, and yes, they did go up for all these darbars with the viceroy and deck up in their jewels and sort of ride elephants for the British. In practice, they were rather interested when with their own, it was their self-interest that motivated them. And just as keenly, you find them sponsoring anti-British forces in British India. So there was princely India and there was British India. British India being governed directly, and the princes governing their section, which is about 40% of India. And you find that they were sponsoring, the Congress Party for the longest time. They had links with revolutionaries. They were funding even educational institutions to which young revolutionaries were attracted. Regional clubs such as the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, the East Indian Association in London, which was started by Dadabhai Nauroji to sort of irritate and annoy the British in London under the nose of the Queen. So this is not what allies are meant to do, right? An ally is supposed to be very much a part of your imperial enterprise. Somebody is helping who's helping you hold up the whole thing. But you find that in reality the Rajas did do that, officially speaking, but then unofficially, where it suited their interests, they were capable of doing the opposite, which is trying to subvert the empire, subvert the claims of the colonial state, and constantly challenging and questioning the pressures and then the kind of inroads the colonial state was making. And that is why, while they were officially allies, I call them false allies because they were not very sincere to the alliance.
That's rather an interesting take, and an often overlooked side effect of colonialism, if we can say, was the speed at which it propagated the notion that Indian princes were, uh, were hungry for lust, the luxury of elephants and everything. And in the very beginning of your book, you also quote Indira Gandhi, where she says, "Go and ask the princess how many wells they have dug up," which also shows rather popular perception of Indian royalty, in my view. How do you see that?
No, there's a reason why the Rajas were caricatured. First, they were caricatured by the British because the British needed an excuse and a justification for their presence in India. Imperialism in India was justified on the basis of the idea that firstly, this was not one country. This is just a warring collection of states, and it was the British who came and brought order to India. The second claim was that the natives don't know how to govern themselves. They don't have proper institutions. They're backward, and therefore we need to teach them, we being the British. So they were here in that sense to civilize Indians, which meant they could, considering that they only ruled about 60% of the country and 40% was still under the Rajas, they couldn't ever concede openly or admit that the Rajas as a class were capable of good governance. So you had to caricature them and make it look like, oh, these natives also who are an authority, who do have power, even they are no good, and we need to hold their hands and guide them. So that was the caricature, the origin of the stereotype. What happens is that the Indians in princely India as well as British India actually resist this caricature. Nationalists, Gokhale, Ranade, Dadabhai Nauroji, they're all quite fond of the princes. They see princely states as places that were not under British rule. So, you have British ruled India, and then you have Indian ruled India. They saw it as in a part of India that may be under the colonial umbrella, but was still run by Indians, for Indians, with Indians, and not with the white man dictating, too many things. Certain things the white man could dictate, but in great measure, the Rajas continued to have a lot of power. So they, in that phase, were very happy with the princely states. Gandhiji, as late as 1935, I think, was saying that, you're intervening in the princely states and meddling in princely politics like the Congress interfering in Sri Lanka or Afghanistan. These are sovereign entities. You don't go and meddle there. You focus on British India, was Gandhiji's message. What happens, however, is that in the last 12, 15 years of the freedom struggle, you start seeing that there is an overlap between princely politics and nationalist politics. And that's when the Congress party and the princes fall out with each other. So even Gandhi denounces the princes. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who in 1929 praises Maharajas like the Maharaja of Mysore and says that if his subjects are unhappy, then there's something wrong with the subjects rather than with the king. 20 years later, he's the man who actually sits with a danda and gets all these princes to sort of integrate their states with the Indian Union. So the mood and the climate, the overall situation changes, and the Rajas do become more repressive. In the final 15 odd years or final 2 decades of British rule in India, the Rajas start allying, for example, with the Hindu Mahasabha rather than the Congress, because the Congress and they have fallen out. They start becoming more and more sort of violent in the way they put down movements for democratic rights in their states. So in Travancore, you have Punapra Vayalar, which was a violent incident. In Mysore, you have Vidura Swatha. These are, premier states. These are extremely well-governed states. But the rulers become dictators in this time, and they're not willing to see. They realize that the sands are shifting, and they're trying to hold their own, and they become repressive. It is in this phase that the Congress and they, as I said, fall out. As a result of which, when India becomes independent, and some princes are not very happy with having to give up their power, such as Nizam of Hyderabad. Even the Raja of Travancore tried to see if he could be independent. So then they ended up with a bad reputation, because after 1947, we have the constitution coming in, we become a democratic republic, all of that. And it looks like the princes stood in the way of that, which they did in that final decade and a half. So that then results in the caricature that the British invented, which the nationalists earlier rejected, but now it sort of gets reappropriated by the nationalists themselves, and it's used against the Rajas. And that quote by Indira Gandhi, where she says, "Go ask these Rajas how many roads they built, how many wells they dug, and how many schools they built. If you look at the sum total of their achievements, it's a zero." It's not quite true. The princely states were not places where zero was achieved. A great deal was achieved there. In fact, a great deal of the nationalist struggle derived its support from the princely rulers. But Indira Gandhi herself said it in a context where 20 years after independence, the princes were financing opposition parties. They were using their vast financial resources against the Congress party. So she was making a political statement. And after our socialist turn in the 60s, princes became a bad word again. And we've since then associated them with these bad things like feudalism. Of course, monarchy is built on a feudal edifice. There's no denying that. But it's sort of been reduced to the idea that they just sat on silk cushions, issuing arbitrary orders and doing what they wanted and drinking champagne in the evening, and dancing girls came and entertained them all the time and that kind of thing. But it eclipses the fact that that's not actually true. And more importantly, even if one dislikes the Rajas, which is, and there are good reasons to dislike some of the Rajas, not many of them are very pleasant. But even so, considering that they ruled over 40% of the Indian subcontinent, it is not sensible to make arguments about modern Indian history while excluding this 40% chunk that was princely Indian ruled India, and focus overwhelmingly on what is in British ruled India, where the nationalist struggle took place. I think 70 years after independence, we can start to look beyond the freedom struggle at stories that also happened in the 40% chunk. If for nothing else, what happened in British India gives us 60% of the story. What happened in princely India can hopefully contribute 40% of the rest of modern Indian history.
Yes. So you talked about the shift in how the nationalists saw the Maharajas, the Princelies, and how the British. But how was the engagement of Indian princes from what from their point of view? How do they saw the nationalism, and how did they shift their focus in the freedom
At
struggle?
first, they were very friendly with the nationalists for the simple reason that they had a common enemy. Both the nationalists and the Rajas had a common, overlord, which was the British. Both were pressuring them in different ways, and they found that there was every reason to ally with the nationalists because they essentially wanted common goals. So when Tukojirao Holkar of Indore contributes 25,000 rupees to Dadabhai Naoroji's East India Association in, I think, the 1870s, and says that, oh, this is in recognition of your patriotic exertions for India and to bring this true state of India to the eyes of the British public, he's actually very proactively supporting this nationalist platform that's been set up by Dadabhai Naoroji. When princes are told not to donate to the Congress party in 1887, for example, and yet as late as 1901, you find Maharaja of Baroda admitting to the Viceroy that he had in fact been continuing to donate to the Congress party. Again, you see that they have a reason to support the Congress, because what the Congress does is it makes the British uncomfortable in British India, and the Rajas want the British to be uncomfortable because then the pressure on them from the British is so it's a way of fighting back that pressure as well. So it becomes an alliance between the princes and the nationalists at that time. In fact, the princes, the British also sometimes need the princes to negotiate with the nationalists. For instance, in the 1910s, Madan Mohan Malaviya, the Congress leader, who was also a very proud Hindu, he was very upset with certain plans to construct some, dam projects on the Ganga, etc., etc. And he said, this is a sacred river, you can't do this, etc. The British actually, they tried to negotiate with him. It didn't work because they were foreigners. So what the British ultimately did, they had to get a Rajput Raja, a Brahmin Raja, Maratha Raja, Rajas from all over the place, and create a small panel, which ended up negotiating with Madan Mohan Malaviya. And then ultimately a compromise was reached. Rajas were required by the British. So it wasn't as though the Rajas did not have leverage. They often did have a great deal of leverage. That's one of the reasons why, if you look at the Treaty of Versailles, the only signature on it after the First World War, when the treaty was signed, you have the US president and you've got other great powers, but you also have an Indian Maharaja because he stood there for India and represented the Indian people at the signing of the treaty. You find that when the Khilafat movement began, it was to the Nizam of Hyderabad that the British turned because they needed to retain the loyalties of the Indian Muslims and did not want Indian Muslims caught up in what was happening after World War I in Ottoman Turkey, where the Caliph had been deposed by the British. So they required the Rajas too, and the Rajas knew this, and the Rajas manipulated it, as the Rajas also worked with the nationalists to sort of behind the scenes put pressure on the Raj. They were initially, having a common enemy helped. It gave them a common cause. What happened, as I said, was by the 1930s, it became clear that the common enemy was leaving, which left the Rajas looking like the new enemy. For the viability of the nation, it was important that the Rajas also had to go. And that's when the Raja sat up and said, hold on, we've been singing your praises and supporting you all this while. In fact, as late as the 1920s, somebody like Lord Curzon, who wasn't prone to exaggerating, he was not the kind of man to make things up, a very stern imperialist. He believed even in the 1920s that there were a lot of Maharajas continuing to give support to the Congress party covertly, a lot of it financial. They had common reasons at that time. They had a common ground. It was when the ground shifted and they found that they were no longer on the same page that the Rajas and the nationalists suddenly discovered that they were perhaps enemies now.
You mentioned the Maharaja of Baroda, and there is largely a forgotten act of dissent against colonial rule by one of the Maharajas of Baroda, Sayaji Rao III, when in the Delhi Darbar, when he came to the prince, he showed his discontent and uh, what you can say, he showed his back to the emperor at that time, which was a big act of discontent at that time. So do we get any more incident of such nature of dissent where the Maharajas openly did not follow the British norms?
Well, multiple cases actually. The thing is, you take again in the 1860s, for example, 1860s and 70s, the Maharaja of Indore was very difficult for the British to control for the simple reason that he ran his state well. Of course, it was not a democratic environment; it was very much an autocracy. But he ran it well. Finances were in order. His subjects didn't have complaints. He was investing in the railways. He was setting up a cotton mill. He was, doing a fair amount of progressive things while not relinquishing any of his power. So they couldn't complain against him, but they found that he was using that to his advantage and helping other Maharajas, such as Mysore Maharaja, the ruler of Dhar, whose states were under threat from the British. The British had threatened to take over these states completely, and he was lobbying with them to, reinstate the royal families and give them back their ancestral kingdoms, which the British did not like, because he was essentially sending people to London, supporting lobbyists in London, etc., and using his financial resources, and they knew it, which is why no matter how many groveling letters he wrote to them, they described him as a notoriously disloyal chief who was constantly throwing obstacles in their way. As early as 1857, he claimed that the troops of Indore during the 1857 rebellion attacked the British. And when the Raja was asked, he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I lost control over my troops." But there is subsequent research to show that he didn't actually lose control of his troops. He just looked the other way, and created a situation where the troops could go ahead and attack the British. But because he didn't officially condone it, in case the rebellion flopped, he wouldn't be directly blamed and toppled either. So he was playing a double game there. And the Rajas knew these double games that were happening. So even the more diplomatic Rajas like Vishakam Tirunal and Travancore in the early 1880s, he was a sitting ruler in power. He could have been really pressed by the Raj had they wanted. But already with his accomplishments, with his education, he was interested in botany, science, could write commentaries on the Sukha Sandesham and Sanskrit poetry. So all round, he was a very impressive man. And therefore, he couldn't be bullied easily. He, in fact, openly wrote a public letter to the governor of Madras when the governor of Madras was planning to pull out, well, rumored to be pulling out funds from education, saying that education is politicizing the natives. And he said, no, that's actually a negative way to look at it. The British Empire must eventually give power to Indians. And he urged the British to look at that as an achievement rather than as a calamity, saying that the day the British Empire hands over power to Indians is a wonderful day and it's going to come inevitably, and the British should not stand in the way. And that was it was diplomatically worded, but it was still fairly clear what the Maharaja was hinting at. Sayajirao Gaikwad was even more blunt. Not only was he meeting the big Congress politicians of Pune, Tilak, Gokhale, people like that, he was even engaging with revolutionaries, Madam Kama, Shamji Krishna Varma, every time he traveled abroad. Of course, his defense whenever he was interrogated on this was that, oh, it was just a casual meeting. But the thing is, when a Maharaja meets somebody like that, it's also a political message. It's a little bit like the Chinese object every time we do anything around the Dalai Lama, because the Dalai Lama has no power, but that symbolism, the moral prestige and authority he can command means that every such meeting not only sort of burnishes his standing, but also the other party ends up gaining something. And that's what Sayajirao Gaikwad was doing. His state was a place from where a lot of anti-British propaganda was published, and the British knew this. In fact, one of his divans was a Congress president. He had Aurobindo, who was a young revolutionary and a firebrand, who eventually went into exile, sort of, in French territory and became Sri Aurobindo, the spiritual guru. He was his speech writer. Sayajirao Gaikwad had around him people who the British were hugely suspicious of. And when he was once questioned after a raid, they found some contraband, publications in his territories. When his government was questioned, he actually said, "Forget the material being published. How on earth did you invade my territory in the first place? Who gave you authority to enter Baroda and carry out the raid?" And in fact, one of his ancestors, and this is the ways in which the Rajas could needle the Raj, right? For instance, in Baroda, there were these dacoits who would descend, this is in the mid 19th century, they would descend into British territory around Baroda in Gujarat. And as soon as the British police chased them, they would run back into Baroda territory and disappear up the hills. And the British police could not enter Baroda because even though they were in pursuit of the dacoits, they couldn't enter Baroda. And every now and then the Raja would sort of catch a few, give them to the British just to sort of make it look like he was doing something. But in reality, the British, with good reason, suspected that the raiding was happening and this dacoitry was happening with the Raja's permission, or if not permission, some kind of tacit approval. So, the Rajas had various ways in which they showed their dissent. A lot of it was legalistic. They could use legal concepts of the Raj, ideas, moral concepts, and word it in English and present their case in a very strong way. And this used to hugely infuriate the British. They hated the idea that British legalisms could be appropriated and claimed by Indians to sort of, articulate their resistance to the Raj. It thoroughly irritated the British, in those days. And Rajas could mark their dissent in all kinds of small ways as well. For example, ritual matters. In Hyderabad for generations, the Nizams would not allow a British resident, the British resident, to enter the Darbar with his shoes on, because they said everybody removes their shoes, you also have to remove your shoes. They would fight with the British resident, not just in Hyderabad and other states also, on whether the seat of the resident should be on the left or the right, because the right was more honorable. So naturally, the British wanted the right, whereas the Raja said, no, you sit on the left because we're going to give you less honor. So, there were all kinds of subtle ways, there were all kinds of diplomatic ways, but there were also very direct ways by which Rajas could mark their dissent, even simply by, excusing themselves from imperial events. A lot of Rajas used to get these diplomatic illnesses every now and then. Every time the British insisted they come up to Calcutta or Delhi for a big procession, and it was demeaning for the Rajas. We think the Rajas enjoyed sitting on elephants and riding in large processions. They didn't always like that. In their states, it made sense because it sort of gave that royal aura or whatever. But in Delhi, doing it in front of the British was a slavish thing. So a lot of them hated doing that. Therefore, a lot of them would suddenly fall ill every time there was one of these processions to be done. And then the British would have to either go and yell at them, persuade them, threaten them, and find ways to get them to come. And even then, they would not always succeed. Maharana of Udaipur managed to get away with it. Travancore ruler in 1877 conveniently fell ill before the 1877 Darbar and ended up sending his minister rather than himself. So there were small and big ways in which you could resist the Raj. Again, I'm not saying that this was street agitation, this was some kind of mass movement. It wasn't. But mass movement really picked up in India only in the 1920s, 30s, and down into the 1940s, with Gandhiji coming onto the scene. The previous very many decades of the fight against colonialism was it had multiple strategies in play at multiple levels by multiple people of multiple kinds. And in that phase, the Rajas were one integral element. They also resisted the Raj, and they were also respected by the nationalists for doing that.
Yes. And in a way, you are saying that the kingship itself had to be reinvented in a way, and the Britishers had to adopt and traditionalize themselves according to the Indian sentiment. Like somewhere you also gives an example of the Mysore Raja and he celebrating Diwali, which is
Dasara, yes.
Dashara, which is a
Yeah.
Vijayanagar tradition, and the Britishers also had to adapt to that. So my question is, how do you see the whole concept of colonial modernity then in this scene?
So the thing is, kings realized in the 19th century that, and for good reason, of course, this is, the British basically told them that you must progress, which means you must build roads, you must build tanks, you must irrigate your lands, your subjects must not be taxed harshly. And a lot of that you can actually agree with, which is that, ideas of kingship that existed in the 18th century would not have made sense in the 19th century. One of the disruptions of colonialism was that a lot of Indian, the most sort of dynamic Indian powers, whether it was Tipu Sultan or other rulers in the north, etc., they all collapsed. And what remained was states that somewhere couldn't easily transition to this new modernity. So in the first part of the 19th century, you find a lot of rulers struggling to get to terms with this new setup, where on the one hand they're protected from foreign enemies by the British, but the British are also therefore the biggest enemy because they can swallow you up, they can take over your states, etc. And therefore, by the middle of the 19th century, a lot of the Rajas start realizing that the one way to preserve your autonomy, to preserve your kingship, is not just to focus on the traditional side of things, which is your rituals, your processions, your religious side of things, but also to focus on good governance. Good governance, not necessarily because the Rajas always, I mean, a lot of Rajas, in fact, as late as the early 20th century, Maharana of Mewar said that, cart tracks worked perfectly for 1,000 years. Why should I build roads? Because, if something worked for 1,000 years, what is this whole fetch around constructing roads? So there were rulers like that. But a lot of other rulers realized that constructing roads, having well-run states, having a full treasury, having schools being built, this minimized the space the British had to interfere in the name of misgovernment. Misgovernment was the term the British used whenever they wanted to interfere in the princely state. So you reduce the room for that. And by doing so, you reduce the amount of influence the British can claim in your state. So in Travancore, for example, by the 1850s, the Raja realized that he had to really upgrade his administration, modernize. And he dies, and his young nephews, for the next 25 years, this is what they do. They bring on board a very well-trained Diwan, a very powerful man called Sir T. Madhav Rao, who then goes on to help two other Indian princely states as well, in northern India and western India, Indore and Baroda. And it sort of exports this idea of model state or good governance to these states as well. And they start churning out English reports, statistics, numbers. A lot of the numbers, by the way, are exaggerated. They're just made to look the state look better than it actually is. But it serves the purpose. You bombard Madras before Madras comes and pokes its nose in your business. You bombard Madras with reports. You bombard Madras with data and statistics, and suddenly, wow, Travancore is a very well-run state. So amazing. A lot of the reforms that were passed sometimes stayed just on paper, or just around the capital. In the countryside, things continue to be very feudal. But the Rajas saw it as a strategy by which to push back against British pressures that were coming into their lives. So that was one way in which they redefined their kingship. A lot of in Mysore, for example, the Rajas realized, and this is something multiple Rajas realized. You have traditional rights of kingship, which in Mysore's case went back to the Vijayanagara tradition of hosting a big royal dasara. But you also could, if to justify the kind of money you spent on these traditional things, and the British looked down on these traditions. They looked down on these as backward and superstitious and so on. So to justify that, the Mysore Maharajas also started having an industrial exhibition in parallel. Because then what you have is you have your traditional kingship where the Raja sits on a throne in his traditional costume and sort of celebrates Dashera. But you also have an industrial exhibition which articulates a new vision for the state. And industrialization becomes this motto for the Mysore government. Mysore government starts investing in huge industrial projects, one of the biggest dams in the world, iron and steel works, gold mines, of course, they already had all kinds of huge industrial enterprises. By the 1940s, they were even planning a car manufacturing unit. When we think of princely states, we think of elephants. We don't think of ambitions to manufacture cars. But that was the case in Mysore because for them, industrialization was a form of economic nationalism. It was a form of telling the British that you say we natives are not good at governance, we're not good at science, we're not good at technology. Here we are disproving you. And therefore, the Mysore kings poured in huge amounts of money into these projects. Many of them were white elephants. They just simply drained away a lot of the funds of the state without giving the Mysore government profits or any returns for decades. But it was not about profits to begin with. It was about making a statement, and the Rajas continued. So kingship in the colonial period had to deal with modernity and what modernity entailed, which involved a sort of reduction of kingly power. But kings also had to continue tradition because they believed their legitimacy also came from continuity, from falling back on religion, from falling back on some of those customary ideas. And it was in gelling the two that some Rajas succeeded, some succeeded less, some succeeded more, but everybody, for most part, made an effort. At least in the big states, they made an effort to do this. The states that didn't need to do that was usually the Rajput states because the British were so in awe of the Rajputs and the location of Rajputana, which is close to the frontiers of British India, and the idea that the Rajputs were these big fighters, and the Raj would therefore call on them every time they needed to defend the Indian Empire, meant that the Raj was a little more circumspect about meddling with the Rajputs and their internal structures. So the Rajput system, which is in the 7th chapter of the book, is slightly different. But in a lot of the other states, they modernized, and it was even one of the first, as the scholar Rahul Sagar has argued, one of the first draft constitutions to be written in India was not in British India. It was in princely India. It was Sir T. Madhav Rao, after his experience in Travancore and while he was in Baroda, in Indore, and before he came to Baroda, that in the context of Baroda, he decided that one way to make sure that the princely states survive, one way to make sure that they're well governed, is to give them a basic constitution and let a few states voluntarily take it up. And if the states succeed, others will also start following. Because having that kind of a constitution where the ruler restricts his expenses, the ruler allows his bureaucrats to run the government and doesn't meddle on a daily basis, it's not a great constitution in terms of its nuances and sophistication, but it was in that late 19th century period a very innovative document. And you can read more about that when Rahul Sagar does his book on Sir T. Madhav Rao. You must invite him on the show. He's an excellent scholar.
Definitely. Coming back to your book, you take the story forward with Ravi Verma's journey in 5 princely states. Uh, why did you choose only the 5 princely states that you did, like Travancore, Baroda, Udaipur, and which all were the princely states that could not get place in this book?
I chose Ravi Verma for the simple reason that, firstly, he was a very popular portrait maker for these royals. Secondly, he had royal connections himself. His sisters-in-law were Maharanis of Travancore. His granddaughters later became themselves Maharanis of Travancore. His ancestors were Rajas in Malabar. So he came from that royal sort of context. And that's why even as an artist, while a lot of his contemporaries were treated as artisans, he was treated as an artist. And there was a difference in the way they were received. Ravi Verma was often received not as an artist, but as an aristocrat, which meant that he was very much an insider to that world. All the same, and remember, the larger argument of the book is also how there were overlaps with the nationalists in this period. He also was on very friendly terms with Tilak, with Gokhale. He painted a portrait of Dadabhai Nauroji as well. He's the one who helped popularize Tilak's Shivaji Jayanti and Ganesh festivals with popular lithograph prints that he used to print at his press. So he was involved in that very interesting time in both of these worlds. He was very much part of that ecosystem. And the other thing was that the princely states, there are far too many. There are officially 562, but even if you narrow it down to the 100 odd major princely states, yeah, that's a lot of states to cover. And I did not want to do a generic textbook on the princely states, which was just all over the place. I wanted to select a few of them that I could go into in depth, go into in some degree of seriousness, so that it would become clear how diverse they were, what their internal histories were. That's the other argument of the book, that when we say princely state, we assume that there was some standard format and structure to them, which is not true. A lot of the princely states were, they were very diverse, very different from each other. Nizam's internal structure is not the same as Travancore. Travancore's internal structure and Baroda's structure is different. Baroda's issues, political issues, are different from, say, Mysore's. In Baroda, it was about Marathas ruling over Gujaratis. In Mysore, it was about Vokaligas, Lingayats, Marathi Brahmin bureaucracy, and the Vadiyars, with the shadow of Tipu Sultan over their head. So the Rajput system was very different, with Bhil tribals, Jat peasants, Rajput vassals, and the king jostling for power, all different elements. So I wanted each state to be taken so that it could be studied almost independently. And Ravi Varma was useful simply in shortlisting the states. He was born in Travancore and worked there as a young man. In the 1870s, after many years in Travancore, about 16 years in Travancore, for the first time he steps out and goes to Pudukkottai, which is in Tamil Nadu. And there he does a series of portraits. So I get an opportunity to speak of this Tamil kingdom, whose rulers were not some Kshatriyas, as you would imagine for example, with the Rajputs, but they belong to a caste called Kallars, which officially, the British used to translate as a robber caste. So you have a ruling dynasty that comes from a so-called caste of robbers. So the dynamics of that state are very interesting. Then in 1881, he goes to Baroda. So it gets me to talk about a Maratha state, and a Maratha state in a Gujarati area. So again, very different set of dynamics there. Then he comes down to Mysore. So you get Mysore discussed over there. And finally, a few years before his death in 1901, he goes to Udaipur. So you get the Rajput system as well. So that's why he allowed me to pick a very different set of states. Each one is distinct. Each one has its own interesting narrative and story. And by weaving him as a common thread, I don't want to write a book of standalone essays on each state. I wanted something to be common through the whole book. And Ravi Varma, as I say in the introduction itself, he's a cameo appearances in many of the stories. He's there in the background. He's there as somebody who comes and paints the Rajas. And I use the paintings to sort of reflect on what the Rajas wanted their political image to be, etc. But beyond that, the book is not about him. The book is about the world of Raja Ravi Varma rather than about Raja Ravi Varma himself. Although, again, because his granddaughters are the Maharanis of Travancore, he does ultimately, in that sense, also belong in the story, because I also relate their story. I also relate, the story of his own relatives around him who were royal, and therefore, I thought he's a good thread by which to connect the states. The states I had to leave out. Unfortunately, I wanted to do something on Hyderabad, but this manuscript was already 170,000 words, which is 550 pages, and I had no desire to add another 50 odd pages to that. I wanted to do something on Indore very seriously, but I already had a Maratha state, so I didn't want to do another Maratha state. But perhaps I don't know. At some point, I knew something on Indore, and I wanted something from Eastern India as well, but which didn't work out, unfortunately, because Ravi Varma never went there. So what we have is 3 southern states, 1 North Indian state, and 1 Western Indian state, and that's how the book has been structured.
Yes, and out of all the portraits that you have mentioned in the book, the first portrait, that Avasthi Thiruna's portrait, in a tricycle, that is, I think, the most interesting of all. And you
Yes.
mentions about the royal, a quad cycle that the Queen Victoria had. So, to what extent the portraits made by Ravi Verma helped you in your research in understanding the subject you were writing on?
So
And
the
were
thing,
there any
yeah.
certain iconographies, in the portraitures?
That's the thing. So Ravi Varma, when he did royal portraits have never been just about capturing the face of the ruler. It's always been about positioning an ideal version of the ruler. It's royal portraits, whether you look at any time in history, it's about communicating something. It isn't just because the Raja said, "Oh, look, I want to see how I look, and therefore let's call somebody to do a portrait." No, it's about presenting a certain image. It's about presenting what the Raja thinks of himself to the world. So one, a fond portrait in the book, for example, is the Raja of Pudukkottai, Ramachandra Tondaiman, very weak ruler, completely bullied by the British, did not have a very successful career. But even in his portrait with Ravi Verma, we can read so much because Ravi Verma dresses him in traditional Indian clothes. So he's wearing like an achkan and embroidered sherwani type thing. But if you look in the background, there is the gopuram of his family temple that is visible, which is supposed to signal continuity. It's supposed to signal his dynasty's connection with the deity and that kind of divine idea of kingship. But all the same, in the same painting, Ramachandra Tondaiman is also resting his hand on a book, and I think it's a copy of the Iliad, which is his way of also signaling that much as he's linked to tradition, much as he's linked to his ancestral god, he's also very much a man of the modern world who's read everything there is to read in Western literature, starting with the Iliad, and who's very comfortable in that side of his identity as well. So the painting's combining two things. It's combining the Raja's very modern sort of impression along with his traditional kingship combined into one place. The Ashwati Tirunal painting that you mentioned, which is fascinating. It's this teenaged prince. And in fact, there's another painting in which I didn't include in the book, which is him as a young boy with his brother. And there's this caricature that Indian princes were backward, knew nothing about the world, etc. But it's fascinating that in this painting, the two boys are shown standing in front of a globe. And the older boy is pointing at America and the globe, and the younger boy is holding a book in his hand in which the page describes America. And again, the two boys framed in that painting are making a statement that we may be in India, we may be in quotes, native princes, but we are very interested in what is happening in the world, and we do know what the wonders of America are. We are connected to that story. That junior boy grows up and becomes Ashwati Tirunal of the painting you were referring to, where he sits wearing English trousers and coat on a tricycle, because in the 1880s, the tricycle was this very fancy thing that all the elites in the West and in Egypt and all kinds of fancy places were using. Queen Victoria had one, the ruler of Egypt had one. So having a tricycle was to essentially say that I am part of that same cosmopolitan culture. I'm part of that same thing, as was he signaling by wearing Western clothes, etc. Even his hobbies, photography, the fact that he went on to go and study at college and get a BA degree. There's in fact a news report about how he wrote his exams with all the other students in the same hall, and how it was such a wonderful thing to see a prince doing that. All of this was about signaling the fact that, oh, I'm a modern prince. I'm a new kind of prince. Of course, Ashwati Tirunal dies very young, so he never becomes a Raja. But the other big painting I liked was also Ravi Verma's painting of Fateh Singh of Udaipur. Because if you look at all of Ravi Verma's other paintings, the Rajas are consciously depicted as modern. There are always these English books. There's always some, either in posture or in the elements that are in the painting, there is an involvement of the colonial state. There is something present there. In the Udaipur painting, however, it's very clear the Maharana was not interested. The Maharana wanted oil painting and that Western medium, but he would choose how to show himself in a traditional way, a wholly traditional way, through that Western medium. So in the Udaipur painting, the Maharana is not wearing his English medals. He's not wearing robes of honor that the British have given him. He's not wearing one of those things on his chest with Queen Victoria's face on it. None of those things. He's holding in his hand a shield, and in the other hand, he's got a sword. And he's basically wearing this long angarkha, which is the old-fashioned thing. A lot of the 19th century princes, Ramachandra Tondaiman of Pudukkottai also used to wear that. But as time passed, he replaced it with trousers and achkan, which was considered a more modern princely garb. But Fateh Singh continued to robes, as in the old Persianate/Mughal style. And he had no, he was not embarrassed at all of his so-called backwardness. He did not pick up the English language. His predecessors spoke English, but he consciously, studiously avoided the English language. Nobles at his court, they knew that the king would frown on them if they gave their sons an English education, because he did not like that happening. He wanted people to stay traditional. And that's the one painting where even Ravi Verma's brother in his diary records that, they were fascinated in Udaipur, because the Maharaja commissioned them to do several paintings, but most of them were just recreations of old miniature paintings of his long gone ancestors in the same sideways profile format in oil form, as oil on canvas, as opposed to actually getting Ravi Verma to do one of these modern fancy portraits that he was used to doing. So that also, it tells a story. These portraits are not just pictures of the Rajas. They in their own right also tell very interesting stories about how the Rajas saw themselves and how they wanted the world to see them.
So can we say that it was, like a battle for belonging, like Udaipur wanted to belong to their ancestry, and in the case of Travancore, they wanted to belong to the Western kind of, the sense of royalty.
Not in a full way. Like even in Travancore, they continue to be very, very connected to their temple, to their orthodox rituals. They
Yes.
continue to feed 15,000 Brahmins at state events, and all that continued. But the Rajas were in many ways slightly more anglicized. But again, the two ones I cover in the book, which is Ailim Tirunal and Vishakam Tirunal, they were perhaps more proactive in that. Their nephew, who succeeded them and ruled for 40 years, he was actually an extremely orthodox man. So although he dressed in the same ashkan and trousers, he was not as much of a radical as his uncles. He allowed the state to be run on autopilot. He allowed things to go on as his uncles had set it up. But he himself was not a very forward-thinking ruler. In fact, I would argue that even though he ruled for 40 years, and some changes did take place in the kingdom, including for the better, on the whole, as a ruler, he was mediocre, and he didn't have much of a vision for kingship. His uncles had a very clear vision of what kingship should look like. Moolam Tirunal, the nephew who eventually ruled, was not like that.
Yes, and there was a time, after Ravi Verma's death, that his legacy was challenged. So, can you talk about that time?
So the thing is, he died in 1906, and you find that almost from the next year itself, there's criticism of his work. This is the time when the Bengal School of Art is coming up, and they're about reviving India's own traditional styles. So Ravi Verma using a Western style to paint was now seen as slavish. It was seen as being subservient to the Raj. He should have just resurrected Kerala styles rather than got seduced by this European academic realist style of painting. That was the argument that was made. Of course, other scholars since have countered that argument, saying that authenticity does not come from reviving things. Reviving also assumes that there was some like frozen form of traditional art, and then you have to revive that. Whereas even traditional art was constantly evolving. The Muchi painters of Tanjore were drawing from Western influences as much as Indian influences. The Deccan art, for example, drew from European influences, from Indian influences, and from Persian influences. So art is always evolving. There's no traditional style that you revive as though like it's a rock that someone has to reframe and copy and imitate again. So in that sense, that criticism against him perhaps doesn't hold. But he was toppled. By 1911, it was very clear that he was no longer considered a fashionable artist. The Bengal school artists were now the big thing because nationalism was getting more proactive. Ravi Verma belonged to a time when nationalism was still hesitant to be very direct. It was still working within the frame of the British because it was tough to construct a nationalist consensus in India. It was such a diverse country that it took a while to construct that consensus. By Ravi Verma's death, that consensus was slowly emerging. Younger leaders were coming up. They were not patient with petitions and writing long letters to the British. They actually wanted to start getting on the street and forcing the British to respond to nationalist desires. So in that climate, having something that was more patently and obviously Indian was something people thought needs to be celebrated more than something like Ravi Verma, which was a hybrid style. Even though, of course, Ravi Verma is the one who ended up galvanizing mass feelings around through his art. His prints became extremely popular. Those 1980s serials, long before you were born, when they had Ramayana and Mahabharata on TV, all the costumes, etc., basically derived from Ravi Verma paintings, and that the way he envisioned gods and epic figures. So he did ultimately have a big impact culturally, even though critics fell out with him. But the decline that his reputation went into was not an isolated thing. That entire generation, men like T. Madhav Rao, Sheshaya Shastri, Dinkar Rao, V. Ramayangar, these were the people who helped the Rajas modernize their administrations, and these were men who were called native statesmen in the 19th century. They were seen as icons for Indians across the board because by governing well, they disproved the theory that Indians could not rule themselves. So they were icons of that time. But by the 20th century, India needed new icons. So these men were also toppled. Now they were also seen as not adequately blunt, not adequately direct, not adequately confrontational with the Raj. And after 1905, revolutionary stuff was picking up. It became about confrontation. It became about actually taking the British head on, which Gandhiji, of course, 15 years later would take up to a new level. So that entire generation to which Ravi Verma belonged was sort of sidelined. They were told that you achieved something, but not enough, and we now must achieve more. So Nehru, for example, the younger lot, they had contempt for these older congressmen even, because these older congressmen were seen as moderates, very moderate in their demands, very moderate in their style. Whereas the younger men were called extremists because they thought we must be much more militant in our demands. And but of course, this is also a generational thing. I quote B.R. Nanda in the book, where he says that each generation looks at the previous generation with contempt. And I have a naughty little line there where I say that Nehru, for example, criticized the previous people. And as you may probably know, if you look at social media, poor Nehru is now being called deracinated and completely un-Indian, etc., by certain sections of Indians. So it happens. Every generation has its heroes. The heroes are toppled, and then sometimes we review their legacy and we revisit them. And that's what I'm trying to do in this book as well. The idea is not to glorify the Maharajas. The idea is not to glorify princely rulers or monarchy. But the idea is to argue that they mattered and their political spaces mattered, and they, as political actors, rather than as stereotypes sitting in silken clothes on and riding elephants, as political actors, we must study them seriously if we are to get a better understanding of India.
Yes. In your book, you mentioned the principle, the state of Nagpur, despite being very big in size, very wealthy, but it was taken over by the Raj. But Travancore, on the other side, which was smaller in size, not that wealthy, it remained more or less independent till the end. So, what was that factor or the special about the state of Travancore that other state could not emulate?
Well, often it was just the fact that, some of these things were just accidents. Policy, we assume the British had some kind of standard policy. They did not. Through much of the 19th century, things were very ad hoc. It depended often, to a great extent, it depended on who was the man on the ground. In Travancore, for example, for the longest time, the royal family used to be quite indebted to a British resident called Colonel Munro. And this may be an apocryphal story, but the story, that oral history around it, is that there was a Rani in Travancore in the early 1810s, and she was ruling. But the British were very uncomfortable with the idea of a female ruler, and they said that she must have a son. And she got pregnant, and the story goes that, and this is a story, it's not really, you can't really find it in the files, but the existence of the story is important because it tells you how locals view this particular British resident. The story goes that he immediately informed his superiors that the Rani had given birth to a male heir. And while she was actually just in her late pregnancy, there was no heir yet. It wasn't clear what gender the baby would be born in. And the story goes that he went in front of the Padmanabha Swami temple in Trivandrum and threatened the deity and said that this child better be a boy, otherwise I'm going to bring my guns and cannons and blow up this temple. It's just an apocryphal tale, but that story caught up, and as in Kerala, he's called Munro Sahib. His name was John Munro. He's called Munro Sahib. And Munro Sahib, there are all kinds of legends associated with him, temples, various deities, etc. So there was seen as a positive figure who helped save the state. In Nagpur, in Gwalior, and other states, you have characters who are very unpleasant to deal with. Sometimes you find that because the British were represented by this one-man outlet called the British Resident, you'd find that a resident could get along with one Raja but not with the other. So in Travancore, there was a man called Resident Cullen who was there for a good 25 years, I think. He could not get along with the ruler called Swati Tirunal, but Swati dies and his brother comes to power. He gets along perfectly well with the brother. So sometimes it's the other way around. The Rajas cannot get along with the British, or once the Raja changes, the British are a little more comfortable. So a lot of these things depended on chance. It depended on accidents. It depended on who was on the ground, and of course, it depended on state interests. In Nagpur's case, Nagpur sat on a huge swathe of very fertile and prosperous territory, and the British were keen on that. Secondly, Nagpur was in the way of connecting their territories in the east with their territories in the west. And having Nagpur would allow them to construct railway lines and build communications between these two different sections. Otherwise, the British would have native territory, as they called it, between two chunks of their own territory. So there was strategic interest in wanting to take over Nagpur. But there were other factors also that came in. Often they would in some states they would not allow adoptions, and they would say, okay, Raja's dead, no heirs, therefore we're going to take over the state. In other states they would think that, okay, no, let the state exist, but we will nominate the heir so that we can control the heir and indirectly therefore control the government. It didn't always work that way. Even the adopted Rajas and the so-called submissive Rajas turned to be quite non-submissive. But in each case, the factors could vary. And that's why the policy of the British also varied a great deal from state to state.
So did oral history and folklore legends about the one that you mentioned just now in the previous answer play a role in your research, while writing this book?
They always do, because you hear stories, you hear things, and as I said, these stories may not always have a basis in hard fact, but their existence is again meant to communicate something. Their existence is a way for people to remember what happened, and how. So I mentioned John Munro in Travancore, for example. There's this. He's the one who took over a lot of the temple lands of the Travancore state, and basically said the lands will now belong to the government, but the temples will not be treated badly. They will get fixed allowances from the government. So he did this thing in the early 1810s. And the story, so multiple temples in Kerala have these wonderful oral legends involving Munro, where in one there's a deity in Chenganur who menstruates, and there are these rituals, and there's a big festival around the menstruation. And the story goes that Munro came there and he said, "What rubbish! How can an idol menstruate? I'm not going to sanction funds for this." And he cuts off that item from the list of funds he's supposed to give. And the story goes that his wife immediately started bleeding. She had, and she was very, very unwell. The bleeding would not stop. And finally, Rani and her astrologer told Munro, "Oh, look, the deity is upset. You better go and make a grant to the deity." And he apparently, with his head low, he goes to the deity and says, "I'm sorry, I'll reinstate your grant." And in fact, makes an endowment. And that's how the festival has been run since. It's a story, but it's fascinating, right? It tells you about this white man who's like a bully from the outside, and then how he's tamed and brought under control, if not by native human beings, at least by a native god. Again, it's a narrative that's telling you about that conflict between a foreign ruler and a local culture. And there are other temples. There's a temple in a place called Parimala, where there's this huge Devi temple. Again, there, he made fun of the deity, or he said something negative about the deity, and apparently he started having nightmares, etc. And so he realized, "Oh, I'm sorry," and again comes and apologizes to the deity. So this trope of the resident being humbled in front of local Hindu gods, it's quite fascinating, because it tells you that these are stories perhaps invented by local people to give themselves a sense of control over their destinies at a time when the British are actually looking very dangerous and in a position to bully them. These are ways by which, if in real life you don't have the resources, the guns, and the ammunition to stand up to them, so in narrative you score a victory over them, even if not in the battlefield. These are interesting dynamics of history, and it's oral history, but it's also important because it tells you something about how Indians responded to colonialism, sometimes by standing up and fighting, sometimes by writing petitions and letters, and sometimes by means of their gods and temples. All of these are valid parts of anti-colonial resistance.
And as a historian, there's no way to prove or verify these oral histories, unfortunately. But it it does play a role in weaving the story in a narrative fashion, which I think your book does fantastically well.
Yeah, well, the issue never is to sit and like verify these oral legends. I mean, oral legends will have lots of gaps. They'll always have lots of issues. Chronologically, they can be inconsistent. All kinds of random things can happen in them. But the historian's job is not to sit and judge the thing. For example, in the colonial period, this was a mistake that was made, which is that all of Indian history, the British often put out the idea that Indians had no history because we didn't sit and write history books. We only had stories. But today's historians know that those stories actually do contain, a lot of historical material. It may not be chronological, it may not be heavily footnoted history, but they're actually, these stories are a means by which, in a society that depended a great deal on orality, in a tropical climate where records did not last for very long, this was a means by which to pass on information. And information, if it has to be passed on orally, either it has to be memorized in a very, very strict way, which is not possible for most people, or it has to be passed down as a story, because stories have a way of continuing. Stories have a life of their own. And so that collective memory can be passed down through a story. It may not be perfect, it may have lots of errors in it in terms of dates and time, but at least the core message gets communicated. So historians today take oral history and these things very seriously. And so-called errors in it are not some kind of disqualification against seeing them as valid parts of historical material and resource material.
And when you were looking through the state archives, of the princely states and the British archives, there must be some differences in records about a particular incident. So how did you as a historian tackle that challenge of being uh, non-opinionated or unbiased in that sense?
So, you get different kinds of records in each place, right? So, for example, a lot of the royal shenanigans are not recorded in their own documents, because why will the Raja record his own misdeeds and his own his own naughty activities in his own records, right? So the royal records always full of titles and very respectful and all of that. So if you go only by that, you can get, of course, you can get a sense of what was happening in the state, how the government was run. The Travancore government, for example, from the 1860s has these huge annual reports on the administration that were brought out. You read census reports of the states. You got a lot of material, statistical reports, wonderful data. But a lot of the power dynamics you get from the colonial archive, because the British residents were sitting and actually recording all the negative things that were happening in the states as well. Of course, that has its own prejudices. It has its own leanings and color. But there are ways to, sift through that. You can combine A with B and understand slightly better what is happening. You can combine it with oral material, and then the picture becomes even more clear. You combine it with what's happening below. You combine it with what's happening globally, what's happening in the empire in general. All of that you put together, and then you have something that allows you to come to a reasonable reconstruction of events. So, in a princely state, why is it that a lot of these Rajas felt emboldened in the early 1880s to say things somewhat more directly to the Raj? Because at that time, and it's interesting, I mean, I noticed that Vishagam Dirnal is writing us letter, Madhav Rao is being quite blunt, Sheshaya Shastri in Pudukkottai is being very blunt and direct with the British. And you wonder, what is it about these early years of the 1880s that allows these men to be so open about their nationalist sympathies and so on? And then you realize at that time there was a very popular viceroy called Lord Ripon, and Lord Ripon was seen vastly by very many people as a vastly pro-Indian viceroy. He was very much about involving more Indians in the administration. In fact, he didn't succeed in great measure because his own bureaucrats and his own subordinates thwarted him. But when he left India, there were thousands of people lining the roads because he was the one viceroy that Indians connected to. And then it makes sense. Then you realize, hold on, all these things I'm seeing where these men are being very direct, they belong to Lord Ripon's tenure, which meant having a sympathetic viceroy meant that these people had a window, had an opportunity to say things which otherwise they may hesitate to say with as much directness. Whereas with Lord Curzon, you see the opposite. Everyone's, most people are trying to toe the line, or even if they feel bad, they won't openly say it, with the exception of people like Sayajirao Gaikwad. So sometimes you look at the overall picture, who's coming from England, which party is in power in London. Sometimes what's happening in London matters. The Maharaja of Mysore's kingdom, the British in India, the British establishment in India was very keen on taking over Mysore the moment the Maharaja died. But the Maharaja lobbied London. And in London, when the government fell and a new government came to power through a democratic process of transfer of power there, that ended up saving the Maharaja here. The new government in London negated the orders of the British establishment in India and returned Mysore to the Wadiyar royal family. So even politics in Britain can sometimes have an impact on the individual destinies of an Indian princely state. So again, if you're a historian, you're trained to sort of make these connections and find out why these things are happening. Nothing is happening. I mean, of course, the Maharaja standing up to the British, Maharaja of Mysore, fighting this legal battle against the British is important. He did fight them. He did stand up and for decades and decades had this exchange of petitions with them. But it did not happen in isolation. I will not heroically cast him as some kind of person who won some great battle against the British, because it's more complicated. British politics also played a role, and that also therefore has to be brought into the picture. So historians, our job is to look at the overall picture, try and find as many elements that may be connected to it, and identify why certain things would have happened the way it did.
Yeah, and no doubt this particular book, False Allies in the Age of India's Maharajas in the Age of Raja Ravi Verma, is a beautiful work in that sense. And
I hope you enjoyed the book. I mean, you very kindly done an interview, but I didn't ask you if you enjoyed the book.
No, I did actually, and you can see the bookmarks that I'll have to I'll tweet that some parts of it. So in an interview after the release of your first book, you mentioned that it took you nearly 6 years to complete your first book, and given its extensive research and I think over hundreds of notes and interesting bibliography that you also have in this book. How much time did
this is, I think, 153 pages of notes.
Yes, and I read those, and some interesting, a particular incident where there's this granddaughter of Raja Ravi Verma saying that she had to hide the paintings in the bathroom or something.
Yeah.
That I think was very
Yeah.
interesting.
No,
So
that's the thing, right? That footnote comes where I relate Ravi Verma's earlier career, where people frowned on him for painting. As I said, a lot of people saw painting as something artisans did, not as something aristocrats did. So he had people in his own family. In fact, there are some wild stories about the kind of objections that were raised to him becoming a professional painter. Even him painting for leisure would have been okay, but the idea of him going around India and painting for other people and getting money for it was hugely offensive even to many people in his own family, because they had lands, they had money. Why should you go and stand like a supplicant in front of somebody else? That was seen as a problematic thing in his class of society. And in that context, I put this footnote about his own great granddaughter Rukmini Varma, who's still alive and she lives in Bangalore. And how she could never go to art school, firstly because it was not okay for a member of a royal family to go to art school in those days, but more importantly how even in the palace it was frowned on, because they thought as a teenager, a young girl sitting and painting was too bohemian, too dangerous, not proper behavior. Artists were not royalty, and artists couldn't be, you couldn't combine the two sides in one person. So I thought it was an interesting thing that Ravi Verma faced that pressure in the 1860s, and here you have his descendant facing the same pressure, mixed up and made worse by gender much later in the 1940s and 50s.
yes, and that was very interesting to read. So my question was, how much time did you take to write this book, considering it is a post-pandemic world? The archives were closed for the last 2 years, and it recently opened, and you are in London these days visiting
Yeah.
archives. So tell us about the
It,
writing
I
process of
mean,
the
it's
book.
tough to say how long this book took. You see, the material on Travancore, for example, some of it goes back all the way to 2010. So 11 years back, I've got some of this material. For example, there was this one diary. One of the reasons I also included Ravi Verma's granddaughter's story, which is the subject of the Ivory Throne, my first book, but I've sort of summarized it even in this book, is partly because when I was doing that book, there was this one 3-volume diary set that from a royal tutor who was in Travancore in the 1920s that I simply couldn't lay my hands on. I kept trying to find it. I tracked it down to the auction house that had sold it, but they wouldn't tell me who had actually purchased it. And then by complete serendipity, I ended up finding the diaries, a year after the book was published. And since then, I've been determined that I must, when I get a chance to do something on Travancore again, I must include this new resource because it's fresh evidence. It adds some more insight. It doesn't change anything in the main argument of the Ivory Throne, but it adds more texture, it adds more flavor. So I wanted to include that. So that I collected in 2016 itself. You may know Deepthi Shashidharan on Instagram, and Paul, who runs Sarmaya. And these two individuals were integral to me finding these diaries. So that's from 2016. Some of the other material is actually part of other things I'm doing. I've got another research project that's been going on for years. But in the process, you collect things, right? So when you say you're doing something on India, as I said, you come across lots of these rajas. When you come to these legal issues, constitutional discussions, you find rajas being part of that discussion. Then again, you make notes on those rajas. So in the background, there was this material being collected on the rajas generally. I always, since 2015, I knew I wanted to do a book on the princely states because my first book on Travancore taught me that there is a lot more happening in the princely states than elephants and palaces and dancing girls. And in Travancore, it was about communalism, caste, how power structures are constructed, how they collapse, the internal dynamics of a court, the British and their pressures. All of these things are happening in that one political space. So I always wanted to do a book on the princely states. So since then, I've been at the back of my head collecting material, and yeah, so it just turned out that when the pandemic hit, already done one draft of this. 2019 was the first draft of this book, which was much shorter, and in 2020 I was able to expand it because I already had the material, and the pandemic gave me a window by which I could sit down and do the actual writing and expand it into this 550-page book.
Yes, and you are in London, as I said. You just came. You just returned from the archives. Is there any other idea cooking inside your mind right now, or you're just completing your PhD as of now?
I am completing my PhD. I've got 1 year to turn in my thesis, which is, a very important time. Now I really can't afford to get distracted by other things. There is something else in the works. There's a half-done manuscript, but unfortunately, it's going to be a while before I can go back to that. So yeah, I don't think you can expect any books from me for the next couple of years, I think. For now, it's PhD, and for now, it's just getting that thesis done. PhDs are a long process, and after having come all the way, I don't want to drop it in the final mile. So I want to focus and get that done.
So can you tell us about the thesis of your PhD?
No, I'm superstitious about these things. Till something is done, I don't talk about it.
Yes. So we look forward to those books, and thank you so much, Manu, for being in conversation yet again on Carvaan. It was
Thank you.
truly an honor being in conversation with you as always.
Thank you for inviting me again, and thank you for reading the book. And I hope others will also read it and hopefully enjoy it. And thank you for giving the book so much space and time at Carvaan.
Yeah, I'll show our viewers the copy once again. It's available in all the leading bookstores around you. Get the book through bookstores. And if bookstores are not accessible, it's on Kindle.
Yes.
I think for
For a huge
150
discount, I think.
Yeah, 140 or 170 rupees.
Yes.
Or if you are a book collector like me, that you can see in my background, you should get the hardcover and get it signed by Manu if you can trace him somewhere in India. So and I think we'll end the live here, and we'll quickly move to Clubhouse to take some questions. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining in.
Thank
Don't
you.
forget to subscribe to Carvaan. Don't forget to drop a comment or two, like this live and like this video, share it with your friends and families. Thank you so much.
Thank you.